The village of St. Mildred's Hollow lay in a gentle dip between rolling green hills. Its slate roofs and honey-coloured stone cottages clustered about the ancient church like sheep seeking comfort from the wind. A narrow lane curved through the village centre, passing the post office with its slightly leaning sign, the tea shop with lace curtains forever half-drawn, and the Red Hart Inn, whose polished brass gleamed even in cloudy weather. It was, by all outward appearances, the very picture of rural tranquillity. Yet those who had lived there long enough understood that beneath such tranquillity ran undercurrents of rivalry, resentment, and long memory. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the front window of her modest cottage, observed the village that morning with her customary air of mild absorption. Her knitting rested lightly in her lap, though her needles moved with practiced rhythm. One might have supposed her thoughts concerned only the troublesome matter of dropped stitches. In truth, she was reflecting upon human nature, a subject which, she often remarked to herself, required no travel beyond the parish boundary for full study. Inspector Slack had been in the village for nearly a fortnight, and his presence had unsettled the usual equilibrium. A large man with an air of permanent exasperation, Inspector Slack possessed a voice that seemed perpetually on the brink of rebuke. He had been dispatched from the county constabulary to review procedural standards, a phrase which had quickly become the most frequently repeated and least understood expression in St. Mildred's Hollow. It was widely known that Inspector Slack had not chosen the assignment. Promotion, so rumour suggested, depended upon it. He had arrived determined to impose order, efficiency, and a certain urban briskness upon what he termed village complacency. Unfortunately, village complacency is a stubborn thing. His first week had been spent correcting minor infractions, improperly logged bicycle thefts, unsigned witness statements, and a particularly heated argument regarding the ownership of a rooster. The villagers bore his interventions with strained politeness. They did not like being told how things ought to be done. They had been doing them quite adequately, in their own estimation, for generations. The object of Inspector Slack's most pointed criticism was Sergeant Henry Wells, the village constable, who possessed a mild manner and an unfortunate tendency to stammer when under pressure. Sergeant Wells had served St. Mildred's Hollow faithfully for 20 years. He knew who quarrelled with whom, which hedges concealed courting couples, and precisely how much ale Mr. Frobisher could consume before becoming argumentative. Inspector Slack regarded such local knowledge as sentimental indulgence. "Facts, Sergeant," he had declared loudly in the Red Hart one evening, "are what matter. Not feelings, not village gossip. Evidence. Procedure. Method." Miss Marple, who had been present for a quiet cup of tea at the time, had glanced up with faint interest. Method, she reflected privately, was a splendid thing, provided one understood the nature of people first. It was on a Thursday afternoon, when the air held that golden stillness peculiar to late summer, that the event occurred which would shake St. Mildred's Hollow from its comfortable routines. The setting was Hawthorne Grange, a substantial Victorian manor, standing slightly apart from the village on a rise bordered by ancient yew trees. Its current owner, Mr. Percival Hardwick, had returned to reside there the previous spring after many years abroad. A widower of indeterminate age, though village estimates ranged liberally between 55 and 70 Mr. Hardwick possessed a reserved manor and a fortune believed to have been made in shipping or rubber plantations, depending on whom one asked. He had not ingratiated himself easily. Though he hosted occasional dinners, these gatherings bore the faint chill of obligation rather than hospitality. His niece, Miss Evelyn Hardwick, had come to act as his companion. A pale young woman with observant grey eyes, she moved about the Grange with quiet efficiency, her presence both dutiful and faintly sorrowful. Also in residence was Mr. Lionel Ashcombe, a distant cousin and aspiring man of letters, who occupied a suite of rooms on the upper floor. Mr. Ashcombe wore tweed regardless of temperature and spoke at length upon the decline of civilization. Few in the village could determine precisely what he contributed to the household beyond commentary. Rounding out the domestic staff was Mrs. Dalloway, the housekeeper, a formidable woman with iron-grey hair and opinions equally firm, and Thomas Red, a gardener whose taciturn manner rendered him nearly invisible at social functions. On the afternoon in question, Mr. Hardwick had announced his intention of reviewing certain financial documents in his private study. The announcement, delivered at luncheon, was unremarkable. Yet witnesses later recalled that he had appeared unsettled. He had twice mislaid his spectacles and once referred to a letter he insisted had been removed from his desk. A warning, he had murmured, half to himself. Evelyn had looked up. A warning of what, uncle? But he had waved her question aside. By 4 o'clock the household had dispersed to their respective occupations. Mrs. Dalloway oversaw the polishing of silver. Mr. Ashcombe retired to compose what he termed a political meditation. Evelyn wrote letters in the morning room, and Thomas read continued pruning the yews along the drive. It was Mrs. Dalloway who discovered the body. Her knock at the study door had gone unanswered. Finding it locked from within, she fetched Sergeant Wells, who happened to be passing on his bicycle, summoned by a matter concerning hedgerow trespass. The study window stood partially open. With some difficulty, Sergeant Wells gained entry. Mr. Percival Hardwick lay slumped forward at his desk, one hand resting near a crystal tumbler. His expression was curiously peaceful, as though sleep had overtaken him mid-thought. The doctor, arriving shortly thereafter, declared that death had likely occurred within the hour. No signs of struggle were evident. The tumbler contained what appeared to be whiskey. A decanter stood nearby. It might, at first glance, have seemed a simple matter of heart failure. Mr. Hardwick was not young, yet the doctor hesitated. There is something, he began, then paused. Inspector Slack was summoned. He arrived with impressive speed and even greater authority. Surveying the room, he pronounced, "We shall proceed methodically." His gaze lingered upon the glass. By evening, whispers had begun to circulate. Poison was mentioned. So too was the mysterious warning Mr. Hardwick had spoken of earlier that day. Miss Marple received the news with grave composure. She did not hurry to Hawthorne Grange. Instead, she sat quietly in her parlour, her knitting abandoned, considering. A locked room. A respectable gentleman. A possible poison administered in whiskey. It was all very tidy. Too tidy, perhaps. The following morning, Inspector Slack addressed a small assembly at the Grange. His tone suggested restrained triumph. Preliminary examination indicates the presence of a toxic substance in the deceased's drink. We are treating this as a case of deliberate poisoning. A murmur rippled through those present. Evelyn, pale but composed, Mr. Ashcombe, visibly agitated, Mrs. Dalloway, stiff with indignation, Thomas Reed, unreadable. Inspector Slack continued, "Given the circumstances, it is reasonable to assume that the perpetrator is someone with access to the study and to the decanter." His gaze swept the room with calculated significance. Sergeant Wells shifted uneasily. Miss Marple, who had been invited out of courtesy or perhaps curiosity, observed the faces before her. She noted not merely alarm but calculation. People reacted to death in very particular ways. She folded her gloved hands and offered no opinion. Inspector Slack concluded, "I must ask that no one leave the premises without informing the constabulary. This was not an accident, and I assure you the guilty party will be found." There was in his voice something more than professional determination. There was personal stake. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Inspector Slack had come to St. Mildred's Hollow to demonstrate efficiency, to impose order, to secure advancement. A solved murder would serve him admirably. But murder, she knew, rarely obliged ambition. As the assembly dispersed, Evelyn approached Miss Marple hesitantly. "Do you believe," she asked in a low voice, "that my uncle was truly murdered?" Miss Marple regarded the young woman kindly. "My dear," she replied, "I believe that whenever someone speaks of a warning, it is wise to discover who felt threatened." Evelyn's fingers tightened upon her handkerchief. Outside, the bells of St. Mildred's Church began their measured tolling. The village, so recently bathed in golden summer calm, now held its breath, and somewhere within Hawthorne Grange, perhaps within a drawer, a ledger, or a frightened heart, lay the explanation for Mr. Percival Hardwick's final warning. Inspector Slack intended to find it. Miss Marple intended to understand it. And in that quiet divergence of purpose lay the first subtle crack in what would soon become far more than a simple case of poison in a glass. The peace of St. Mildred's Hollow had been disturbed, and it would not easily be restored. The morning after Mr. Percival Hardwick's death dawned grey and unseasonably cool, as though the weather itself had adopted a tone of inquiry. A faint mist clung to the yew trees lining the drive to Hawthorne Grange, softening their dark silhouettes into indistinct shapes. It was, Miss Marple reflected as she made her way slowly up the path, precisely the sort of morning upon which truth preferred to hide. Inspector Slack had already established what he termed a controlled investigative environment. In practice, This meant that Sergeant Wells stood awkwardly in the hall with a notebook, preventing unnecessary comings and goings, while the household gathered in various degrees of discomfort in the drawing room. Miss Marple was admitted with reluctant politeness. "I must remind you, Miss Marple," Inspector Slack began, adjusting his cuffs with a faint irritation, "that this is a formal inquiry, of course," she said gently. "I shall endeavour not to be informal." He did not smile. The study remained sealed, though the doctor's preliminary report had confirmed the presence of strychnine in the whiskey glass. Not an accidental contamination, not spoiled spirits, deliberate administration. The locked door, however, presented difficulty. The key had been found inside the study, lying on the desk beside the deceased's right hand. The window, though open, overlooked a sheer drop of nearly 12 feet onto a gravel border. No ladder marks. No disturbed stones. A straightforward domestic poisoning, Inspector Slack had declared that morning. The poison was introduced before the door was locked, likely at luncheon. The deceased retires to his study, pours a drink, consumes it, and locks himself in. The poison takes effect shortly thereafter. His tone suggested satisfaction. Miss Marple had not contradicted him. She had merely inquired, with mild curiosity, whether Mr. Hardwick habitually locked himself in. He valued privacy, Evelyn had answered. "But did he lock the door?" Miss Marple persisted gently. Evelyn hesitated. "Not always," Inspector Slack interjected. "That is immaterial. The key was inside. Keys," Miss Marple murmured, "are such obliging little objects. They are forever where one expects them to be until they are not." Inspector Slack regarded her narrowly. Interviews began promptly. Evelyn Hardwick. Evelyn sat upright, hands folded in her lap, her grey dress immaculate despite the circumstances. There was no theatrical grief in her manner, rather a quiet restraint that seemed almost disciplined. "You were with your uncle at luncheon?" Inspector Slack asked. "Yes. Did you observe anything unusual?" He appeared distracted. He mentioned a letter. "What letter?" He did not say, only that it was missing. Did he receive many letters? Yes. Business correspondence, primarily. Inspector Slack leaned forward. "Miss Hardwick, were you aware of any threats against your uncle?" Her eyes flickered, just slightly. "No." Miss Marple noticed the pause. "Had your uncle altered his will recently?" Inspector Slack asked abruptly. Colour rose faintly in Evelyn's cheeks. "I believe so. He mentioned consulting his solicitor. And you are his principal heir?" "I am his only close relative. Convenient," Inspector Slack said flatly. Evelyn stiffened. Miss Marple intervened softly. "It is often inconvenient to be the only relation, Inspector. Expectations can be such a burden." Inspector Slack ignored the remark. Lionel Ashcombe, Mr. Ashcombe, entered with visible agitation. His dark hair fell dramatically across his forehead, and he carried a pipe he did not light. "This is intolerable," he declared. "The suggestion of murder in this house." "Facts, Mr. Ashcombe," Inspector Slack replied coolly. "Your whereabouts yesterday afternoon?" "In my room. Writing. Can anyone confirm?" "That?" "No. Genius is a solitary occupation." Inspector Slack's expression suggested skepticism. "You stand to inherit anything?" Ashcombe gave a short laugh. "My cousin Percival was not generous. But you reside here without apparent employment." "I am composing a treatise." "On what?" "The moral decay of institutional authority." Inspector Slack's jaw tightened. Miss Marple observed that Mr. Ashcombe's agitation seemed genuine but not necessarily grief-stricken. "Did Mr. Hardwick seem troubled recently?" she asked. "He accused someone of interference," Ashcombe replied after a moment. "He said papers had been disturbed. Interference by whom?" Inspector Slack demanded. He did not specify. Miss Marple made a mental note. Mrs. Dalloway, the housekeeper's testimony was delivered with formidable clarity. "I prepared luncheon myself, cold ham, salad, and custard. Mr. Hardwick took 1 glass of claret. Nothing unusual." "The whiskey decanter in the study, who maintains it?" Inspector Slack asked. "I do. I refill it weekly." "When was it last refilled?" "Monday. And yesterday was Thursday." "Yes." "Did anyone else have access?" "The study is cleaned daily." "The decanter is not locked away." Inspector Slack nodded slowly. Mrs. Dalloway's eyes flashed. "If you are suggesting impropriety on the part of the staff, I suggest nothing. I observe." Miss Marple watched the exchange with interest. Mrs. Dalloway possessed loyalty, but also pride. And pride, she reflected, could sometimes mask other emotions. Thomas read the gardener removed his cap and spoke sparingly. "I was trimming the yews, sir. Did you see anyone approach the study window?" "No, sir. Doc, could someone have entered from outside?" Red considered. "Not without leaving marks. Gravel's loose, yet none were found." "No, sir." Inspector Slack seemed mildly frustrated. Miss Marple asked quietly, "Mr. Reed, did you notice anything unusual in the garden this week?" Reed hesitated. "There was a footprint near the tool shed Monday evening. Not mine. Why did you not report it? Didn't think much of it." Inspector Slack's eyes sharpened. By late afternoon, tension had settled thickly over Hawthorne Grange. Inspector Slack gathered the household once more. The poison was introduced before Mr. Hardwick locked himself in. The opportunity existed during luncheon or earlier in the day. Motive? Financial gain is obvious. Personal grievance is possible. Someone in this house feared Mr. Hardwick. Miss Marple sat quietly, her hands folded over her handbag. Feared him. That word lingered. After the formal questioning concluded, she requested a brief moment alone with Evelyn in the morning room. "My dear," she began gently, "when your uncle spoke of a warning, did he seem frightened?" Evelyn looked down. "He seemed angry." "Angry?" "Yes, as though someone had presumed upon him." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And you, my dear, are you frightened?" Evelyn's composure wavered. "I am afraid that Inspector Slack believes me capable of murder." Miss Marple reached out and patted her hand. Inspector Slack believes in efficiency. Murder, however, rarely conforms to efficient patterns. She rose. Outside, Inspector Slack stood in the hall reviewing notes. "Well, Miss Marple," he said stiffly, "what is your impression?" She smiled faintly. "That someone in this house is less surprised than they ought to be." He frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning, Inspector, that grief and shock are cousins, but they do not resemble calculation." Inspector Slack regarded her sharply. "Are you implying I have misjudged something?" "Oh, no," Miss Marple replied sweetly. "I am quite certain you have judged everything." And with that enigmatic remark, she took her leave. As she walked slowly back toward the village, the mist had lifted, but the air felt heavier still. A locked room, a missing letter, a warning, and a household where each member had something however small to conceal. Inspector Slack pursued evidence. Miss Marple pursued people. And already, though no one yet perceived it clearly, the two paths were beginning to diverge. If there is one quality St. Mildred's Hollow possessed in abundance, it was memory. Not the grand, historical sort commemorated by plaques or monuments, but the quieter, more persistent recollection of who had quarrelled with whom in 1938, who had borrowed money and repaid it late, and who had once been seen weeping behind the church vestry after evensong. By the third day following Mr. Hardwick's death, such memories had begun rearranging themselves into new and suggestive shapes. Inspector Slack, determined to maintain command of proceedings, extended his inquiries beyond the walls of Hawthorne Grange. Financial records were summoned. The solicitor in Market Broughton was consulted. Even the bank manager, a cautious man inclined to perspire under scrutiny, was interviewed at length. The results were, on the surface, illuminating. Mr. Percival Hardwick had indeed altered his will very recently. The previous version, executed shortly after his wife's death, had left the bulk of his estate to his niece, Evelyn Hardwick. A modest annuity had been granted to Mr. Lionel Ashcombe. The staff were to receive small legacies. The revised will, signed only 10 days before his death, introduced a striking change. The principal beneficiary remained Evelyn, but her inheritance was now conditional. Should she marry without the approval of her uncle's chosen executor, her portion would be drastically reduced. The executor named was Mr. Jonathan Carruthers, a solicitor residing some distance away and, significantly, a long-standing associate of Mr. Hardwick's overseas business interests. Inspector Slack regarded this alteration with keen interest. "Romantic entanglement," he suggested briskly during a second round of questioning. Evelyn met his gaze calmly. "I am not engaged. Are you acquainted with anyone your uncle might have disapproved?" "Of? No." Her reply was firm, but Miss Marple, seated quietly by the window, observed a faint tightening of her jaw. Inspector Slack turned his attention to Mr. Ashcombe. "You were aware of this change?" Ashcombe's composure fractured momentarily. "No, I was not, and your annuity remains modest. I never depended upon Percival's generosity. Yet you reside here." Ashcombe's voice grew sharp, temporarily. Inspector Slack made a note. Miss Marple, however, was not studying the will. She was studying reactions. Surprise, she knew, was often genuine, but resentment lingered. That afternoon, a further development unsettled the fragile equilibrium of the Grange. Sergeant Wells, conducting a routine examination of the study fireplace, discovered a partially burned fragment of paper lodged behind the grate. Though singed along the edges, several words remained legible. "Last warning, exposed before Sunday." Inspector Slack's satisfaction was palpable. "A threat," he announced. "And the deceased attempted to destroy it, or someone else did," Miss Marple murmured. Inspector Slack ignored her. The timing was significant. Sunday would have been the church fete, an event anticipated for weeks and attended by nearly every resident of St. Mildred's Hollow. To expose, Inspector Slack repeated thoughtfully. "Expose what?" That question echoed through the household with uncomfortable force. Miss Marple, meanwhile, adopted a different method. She began with tea. Mrs. Price Ridley, whose drawing room overlooked the village green, proved a most obliging hostess. Between delicate sips of Darjeeling, she supplied a steady stream of information, none of it, strictly speaking, confidential, though all of it revealing. Mr. Hardwick was not universally admired, Mrs. Price Ridley confided. He had investments, you know. Bought up parcels of land rather aggressively. There was talk of development. Miss Marple repeated mildly. A factory, perhaps, or housing. It would have altered the character of the village dreadfully. Miss Marple nodded. "And who opposed this?" "Oh, several. Mr. Ashcombe was quite vocal. And Mr. Redwell. His father's cottage stands on land rumoured to be under negotiation. Interesting." Land, Miss Marple reflected, had long been the root of discord in rural communities. Ownership was more than property. It was identity. That evening brought yet another disturbance. Lionel Ashcombe was discovered in heated argument with Mrs. Dalloway in the servants' corridor. "You had no right!" he exclaimed. "No right," Mrs. Dalloway retorted sharply. "It was my duty." Inspector Slack, arriving in response to raised voices, demanded explanation. It emerged that Mrs. Dalloway had entered Mr. Ashcombe's rooms earlier that day to tidy and found among his papers correspondence indicating significant personal debt. Several letters bore the unmistakable tone of final demand. "You required funds," Inspector Slack said. Evenly. Ashcombe flushed. "That proves nothing." "It proves motive," Miss Marple observed quietly. "Financial embarrassment can make one desperate, but desperation does not always lead to murder. Sometimes it leads merely to foolishness." Inspector Slack's patience thinned visibly. The following morning, a more tangible clue surfaced. Thomas read, while tending the lower hedgerow, unearthed a small glass vial concealed beneath loose soil near the tool shed. It was empty, but its label, though faded, bore the printed word strychnine. Inspector Slack's expression hardened. "You claimed ignorance of any unusual activity," he reminded Red. "I didn't know about that," Red replied steadily. "You work with soil daily. You expect me to believe this escaped your notice?" Reed's jaw set. "I didn't put it there." Miss Marple studied the vial thoughtfully. "Such containers are not uncommon in gardening," she remarked. "Used for vermin." Inspector Slack seized upon the point. "So you admit access to poison to 4 rats," Red answered curtly. The discovery intensified suspicion. Reed had both proximity and plausible access. Yet something about the vial troubled Miss Marple. It was too obvious, too obliging. By now, the village hummed with conjecture. The Red Hart's taproom hosted animated discussions each evening. Sergeant Wells, caught between loyalty to his community and obedience to Inspector Slack, grew increasingly strained. On Saturday afternoon, as preparations for the church fete continued in muted fashion, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to Hawthorne Grange once more. She requested permission to examine the study. Inspector Slack hesitated, then acquiesced, perhaps out of confidence, perhaps out of curiosity. The room bore the stillness peculiar to places recently vacated by life. Papers lay neatly arranged. The decanter remained upon the sideboard, now empty and sealed for evidence. Miss Marple moved slowly, observing. She paused by the desk. "May I?" she asked. Inspector Slack nodded. She examined the blotting pad. Then she smiled faintly. "There is an impression here." Slack leaned forward. "An impression?" "Yes. A letter was written here recently, pressed rather firmly. Can you read it? Not directly, but one sees patterns." She tilted the pad toward the light. A few faint grooves suggested numbers columns, perhaps. "Financial figures?" Inspector Slack frowned. "We have already secured the documents." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied gently. "But sometimes what is missing is more interesting than what remains." She moved toward the fireplace. "You believe Mr. Hardwick burned the threatening letter? Most likely. Then why burn only part of it?" Slack did not answer. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window. Outside, the gravel border remained undisturbed. "A locked room," she murmured. So very persuasive. Inspector Slack's voice carried a trace of irritation. The door was locked from within. The key was on the desk. "Yes," she agreed. "And keys are so trustworthy." He stared at her. "Do you imply the key was placed there afterward?" "I imply nothing. I merely observe that people are capable of surprising ingenuity." A silence settled between them. For the first time, Inspector Slack appeared uncertain. That evening, another twist emerged. Evelyn Hardwick received a telegram. It was brief. "Letter delivered in error. Regret delay." No signature. Inspector Slack examined it with interest. "What letter?" he demanded. Evelyn's composure faltered. "My uncle expected an important document from London earlier this week." "What document?" "I do not know." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. A missing letter. A warning. A burned fragment. And now a delayed delivery. The pattern, though incomplete, was shifting. Someone had feared exposure. Someone had acted perhaps prematurely. Inspector Slack, however, had reached a provisional conclusion. He summoned the household once more. "The evidence increasingly indicates that the poison originated from the garden stores. The vial found near the shed suggests concealment. Financial motive exists in more than one case, but access is critical." His gaze rested heavily upon Thomas Reed. Miss Marple watched quietly. She had seen this before, the narrowing of focus upon the most convenient suspect. But convenience, she knew, was rarely synonymous with truth. As the gathering dispersed under a cloud of accusation, Miss Marple lingered behind. "Inspector," she said. Softly, "have you ever kept hens?" He blinked. "Hens? Yes. They are most instructive creatures. If one egg goes missing, the entire flock becomes suspicious of the wrong bird." "I fail to see the relevance." She smiled faintly. "Oh, it will become relevant. I am quite certain of it." And as she stepped into the cool evening air, the church bells began to ring in preparation for Sunday's fete, the very day mentioned in the burned warning. Someone had intended to expose something before Sunday. Sunday was tomorrow. And if Miss Marple's instincts were correct, the true danger had not yet passed. Sunday dawned bright and deceptively cheerful, as though St. Mildred's Hollow had collectively resolved to deny the shadow hanging over it. Bunting fluttered along the village green. Trellis tables were arranged with sponge cakes, jam tarts, and carefully labelled jars of chutney. The vicar's wife, pale but resolute, insisted that the church fete must proceed. "Life must continue," she declared, though her voice wavered slightly. Inspector Slack, however, had no intention of allowing festivity to obscure investigation. 2 uniformed constables had been discreetly stationed near Hawthorne Grange. Thomas Read, though not formally charged, was instructed to remain available for further questioning. Miss Marple observed all this from a folding chair beside the White Elephant stall, her knitting once again in motion. To outward appearance, she was the embodiment of mild village contentment. Inwardly, however, her thoughts were brisk and precise. The telegram troubled her. The burned letter troubled her. But most troubling of all was something far smaller. A habit. Mr. Percival Hardwick, she had learned from Mrs. Dalloway, disliked overly diluted whiskey. He kept his decanter nearly empty between refills and poured sparingly. On Thursday afternoon, however, the glass found upon his desk had been filled unusually high. Such details were often dismissed as trivial. Miss Marple did not dismiss them. Around noon, she rose and made her way toward the tea tent, where Inspector Slack stood reviewing notes with visible impatience. "Inspector," she said gently, Might I borrow you for a moment? He looked reluctant but curious. If this concerns hens again, it concerns timing. He sighed, but followed her a short distance away from the bustle of the fete. My dear lady, he began stiffly. I have already established the timeline. The poison was administered prior to Mr. Hardwick retiring to his study. The door was locked from within. The key lay on the desk. There is no evidence of forced entry, Doc White, she agreed pleasantly. But there is evidence of anticipation. He frowned. Consider the burned fragment. Last warning, expose before Sunday. That suggests urgency. Someone wished to prevent exposure at today's gathering. Yes, which strengthens the theory of premeditation. Indeed. But you assume the murder was committed before the letter could be acted upon. He stared at her. Are you suggesting? I am suggesting, Miss Marple continued softly, that the warning was not directed at Mr. Hardwick. Inspector Slack's brows drew together. That is illogical. The letter was in his fireplace, partially burned, she corrected. As though someone feared its full destruction might arouse suspicion or wished it discovered. Slack hesitated. You believe the letter was planted? I believe, she said gently, that someone wished us to focus on motive rather than method. Inspector Slack folded his arms. Then enlighten me as to the method. Miss Marple glanced toward the Grange in the distance. Tell me, Inspector, was the decanter examined? Of course. And the contents? Residual traces only. The bulk of the liquid was in the deceased's glass. She nodded. And who poured it? He did. Are you certain? The door was locked. Yes, she said patiently. But doors are locked by people, not by fate. A flicker of doubt crossed his expression. Miss Marple lowered her voice. You recall the gardener's vial. Too convenient. The debts of Mr. Ashcombe. Too visible. The alteration of the will. Too dramatic. Each suspect possesses motive in plain sight. It is rather theatrical. Slack said nothing. Now consider something quieter. Mr. Hardwick believed a letter had been removed from his desk earlier that week. He suspected interference. He was angry. Not frightened. Yes, if he feared exposure. Why would he burn? Only part of the warning. Slack's eyes sharpened. You think he did not burn it? I think, she said carefully, that someone wished us to believe he had. A bell rang across the green, signaling the start of the raffle draw. Miss Marple continued. Inspector, have you inquired into Mr. Hardwick's overseas business ventures? His solicitor confirmed they were profitable. Profitable for whom? Slack stiffened. Are you implying fraud? I am implying, Miss Marple replied gently, that men who return from abroad with fortunes sometimes leave behind complications. She paused. And complications sometimes follow. That afternoon, Inspector Slack requested an urgent telephonic inquiry to London regarding Jonathan Carruthers, the executor. The response arrived before dusk. Carruthers was not merely a solicitor. He had recently been under quiet investigation for financial irregularities involving Colonial investments linked to Mr. Hardwick. More troubling still. Carruthers had arrived in the village late Wednesday evening. He had signed the register at the Red Hart, but claimed he was passing through and departed early Thursday morning. No one had connected his visit to the case. Until now. Inspector Slack's composure shifted. Why was this not disclosed? He demanded of Evelyn when she was summoned. Her face went pale. He came to see my uncle privately. About what? I do not know. Did they quarrel? She hesitated. Yes. The room fell silent. Miss Marple watched her carefully. What was said? Slack pressed. I heard raised voices. My uncle said, You mistake me for a fool. And Mr. Carruthers replied, You will regret this obstinacy. Inspector Slack's jaw tightened. Why did you not mention this earlier? Evelyn's voice trembled. I did not think it relevant. Miss Marple interjected gently. Did Mr. Carruthers leave immediately afterward? Yes, early Thursday morning. Before luncheon? Yes. Slack paced. If Carruthers administered the poison before departing. Miss Marple shook her head. No, the poison acted swiftly. Mr. Hardwick died Thursday afternoon. If poisoned Wednesday, symptoms would have manifested sooner. Slack stopped pacing. Then how? Miss Marple's voice grew quiet. Inspector, may I ask, where was the key to the study ordinarily kept? In the door. And after Mr. Hardwick's death? On the desk? Exactly. She let the word linger. A man intending to work privately might lock his door, but a man who expected a confrontation might do something else. Slack stared at her. "You believe he locked someone inside door," she said gently. "Someone locked him." The implication settled slowly. "You think the killer remained in the room for a time, but the window was open, conveniently." Inspector Slack's breathing slowed as realization dawned. The gravel was undisturbed, because no one exited that way. Silence. "You are suggesting," he said carefully, "that the murderer entered before the door was locked, remained concealed, and left after staging the scene." Miss Marple inclined her head. Mr. Hardwick poured his drink. Perhaps in anger, perhaps in distraction. The poison was introduced not into the decanter, but into the glass. Slack's eyes widened. The level of whiskey was high. Yes, as though someone else had poured it generously. Then the killer waited until the poison acted, locked the door from inside, placed the key upon the desk, and departed with it. "No," she said softly. "With a duplicate." Slack's expression shifted from skepticism to dawning comprehension. A duplicate key, quite easy to obtain in a large house. He looked at her sharply. "Who would possess such access?" Miss Marple's gaze moved slowly across the assembled faces. "Someone trusted." The room felt suddenly smaller. Evelyn's composure cracked. "You cannot mean—" Miss Marple's voice remained kind. "My dear, I mean only that truth is seldom convenient." Inspector Slack drew himself upright. "Then it is time," he said firmly, "that we hear the whole truth." And in that charged stillness, as the last echoes of the fete drifted faintly across the evening air, Miss Marple prepared to reveal what she had known since the burned letter, the telegram, and the overfilled glass had quietly aligned themselves in her mind. The final piece, at last, had settled into place. The drawing room at Hawthorne Grange had been arranged with uncomfortable deliberation. Chairs formed a semicircle near the fireplace. The fading light of Sunday evening filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward the center of the room, as though even the walls wished to listen. Inspector Slack stood near the mantelpiece, solid and official. Sergeant Wells hovered at the doorway, notebook in hand. Evelyn Hardwick sat very straight, her fingers clasped tightly together. Lionel Ashcombe leaned back with forced nonchalance that did not conceal the tension in his jaw. Mrs. Dalloway remained rigid, as if carved from oak. Thomas Red stood slightly apart, cap in hand. Miss Marple occupied a modest chair near the tea-table. She did not rise immediately. Instead, she folded her knitting carefully and placed it in her handbag. "My dear friends," she began gently, "I fear we have all been looking at this matter from the wrong direction." Inspector Slack inclined his head curtly. "The physical facts are straightforward," she continued. "Mr. Hardwick died of strychnine poisoning in a locked room. The key lay upon his desk. The window was open. A threatening letter was partially burned in the grate. A vial of poison was discovered near the tool shed." She paused. "Each of those facts invites an obvious conclusion, and obvious conclusions are so very tempting." Lionel Ashcombe shifted. "Get on with it," he muttered. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Very well. Let us begin with the letter. Last warning. Expose. Before Sunday." Inspector Slack assumed that Mr. Hardwick burned it. But if he had feared exposure himself, why keep any fragment at all? Why not destroy it entirely? No one answered. "Because," she said softly, "the fragment was not destroyed in haste. It was burned deliberately, but incompletely, left to be found." Inspector Slack nodded slowly. "You believe it was planted?" "I do." She turned toward Thomas Reed. The vial discovered in the garden was equally obliging. Too obliging. Mr. Reed works with poisons for vermin. Anyone wishing to implicate him would know precisely where to place such an item. Reed swallowed. "Thank you, miss," he murmured. Miss Marple inclined her head kindly. "As for Mr. Ashcombe's debts, they are real. But financial embarrassment does not automatically confer homicidal skill, nor does resentment about land development." Ashcombe exhaled sharply. Inspector Slack folded his arms. "Then who?" Miss Marple turned her gaze at last to Evelyn Hardwick. "My dear, you told us your uncle had altered his will, placing conditions upon your inheritance. That change would not trouble a dutiful niece. Unless she feared losing her fortune." Evelyn's face drained of color. I am not engaged, she said faintly. No, Miss Marple agreed gently. But you were. A tremor passed through the room. Inspector Slack's eyes narrowed. Engaged? To whom? Miss Marple's voice remained calm. To Mr. Jonathan Carruthers. Evelyn's hands flew to her mouth. Ashcombe stared. Carruthers? That oily. Solicitor? Miss Marple nodded. Mr. Carruthers' recent financial irregularities were not accidental. He had speculated recklessly with colonial investments, including those connected to Mr. Hardwick. Exposure would have ruined him. Inspector Slack spoke sharply. We have evidence Carruthers was here Wednesday. Yes, to persuade Mr. Hardwick to overlook the discrepancies. When persuasion failed, he threatened him. The last warning was not sent to Mr. Hardwick. It was written by him. The room went still. He intended to expose Carruthers publicly at the church fete, Miss Marple continued. Before Sunday, Evelyn's breathing grew uneven. You see, my dear, Miss Marple said softly, your uncle was angry. Not frightened. He had discovered the mismanagement. He meant to reveal it. Evelyn's voice broke. He would have destroyed everything. Everything, Inspector Slack repeated sharply. My future, she whispered. Silence settled like falling dust. Miss Marple spoke gently, but firmly. You loved Mr. Carruthers. You believed his assurances that the irregularities were temporary. You believed exposure would ruin him and you along with him. When your uncle altered his will, placing your inheritance under strict oversight, you understood that he suspected your attachment. Tears spilled silently down Evelyn's cheeks. I only meant to frighten him, she said faintly. Inspector Slack stepped forward. Explain yourself. Miss Marple nodded for her to continue. Evelyn. Swallowed. I confronted Uncle Thursday afternoon. I told him he was mistaken about Jonathan. He refused to listen. He said he would speak publicly on Sunday. Her voice trembled. He went into his study. I followed. Inspector Slack's expression hardened. You administered the poison? Evelyn shook her head weakly. The strychnine was in the gardening stores. Jonathan had once mentioned its effects, how quickly it acts. She looked at Thomas Reed with stricken eyes. I thought only to make him ill, to delay him, but you misjudged the dose, Inspector Slack said grimly. Yes, Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Evelyn continued in a broken whisper. He poured himself a drink. His hands were shaking. I had the powder in a small paper. I tipped it into the glass when he turned to fetch a ledger. She sobbed softly. I did not realize how strong it was, and when he collapsed, Inspector Slack pressed. I panicked. I locked the door. I placed the key on the desk. I used the duplicate key from the household set to let myself out afterward. I opened the window to suggest escape. Then I burned part of the letter to imply someone had threatened him. Inspector Slack's jaw was set like stone. And the vial in the garden? I dropped it near the shed that evening. Thomas Reed let out a slow breath. Lionel Ashcombe stared at Evelyn in disbelief. Miss Marple's voice remained infinitely gentle. My dear child, poison is a most unforgiving instrument. It does not moderate itself. To intention. Evelyn wept openly now. I never meant no one ever does, Miss Marple said softly. Inspector Slack stepped forward formally. Miss Evelyn Hardwick, I must ask you to come with me. Sergeant Wells looked stricken, but obeyed his superior's nod. Evelyn rose unsteadily. Before she reached the door, she turned to Miss Marple. You knew, she whispered. Miss Marple regarded her with sorrow. I knew that you were the only one who was not surprised. Inspector Slack escorted Evelyn from the room. The door closed quietly behind them. The aftermath unfolded with the subdued efficiency peculiar to English tragedy. Jonathan Carruthers was arrested in London within days on charges of financial fraud. His connection to Evelyn emerged fully under investigation. The altered will remained in effect, the estate passed under legal supervision. Thomas Reed was publicly exonerated. Lionel Ashcombe, shaken but vindicated, departed Hawthorne Grange within the month to pursue employment elsewhere. Mrs. Dalloway resumed her duties with grim composure. Inspector Slack received commendation for resolving the case swiftly. Yet one evening, as he stood outside Miss Marple's cottage, hat in hand, his expression was unusually thoughtful. You are correct, he admitted gruffly. I was focused on procedure. Miss Marple smiled gently. Procedure is invaluable, Inspector, but people are rarely procedural. He hesitated. You realized because she was not shocked. Yes, and because she was protecting someone, not herself. Inspector Slack nodded slowly. The last warning, he murmured, was not meant for the village, Miss Marple replied. It was meant for a guilty conscience. The evening air was soft once more. The bells of St. Mildred's Church rang peacefully across the green. Children's laughter drifted faintly from the lane. Life, as the vicar's wife had insisted, continued. Inspector Slack replaced his hat. "I dare say," he said stiffly, "that I have learned something." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "One always does, Inspector. That is the great comfort of mistakes." He gave the faintest suggestion of a smile before departing down the path. Miss Marple returned to her chair by the window. Her knitting resumed. Beyond the hedgerows, St. Mildred's Hollow settled once more into its familiar rhythms, wiser, perhaps, though not immune to future folly. For villagers, like people, possess long memories. And somewhere in those memories would remain the quiet lesson of a warning unheeded and the gentle persistence of an elderly lady who understood that beneath every tidy explanation lies the infinitely untidy human heart.